So we're very appreciative of your public service and your willingness to come and testify about your experience when it comes to peer review and specifically with high-speed rail.
Thank you, Senator DeSaulnier and members of the committee. Yes, my name is Elizabeth Alexis, and I am a co-founder of Californians Advocating Responsible Rail Design. Our group was founded almost 4 years ago now to provide oversight, advocate for transparency, and make sure that communities were involved in the project. I personally took a lot of interest in the ridership model. My background is in economics, and that was a fit with my skills and training. I want to talk about peer review generally a little bit to then compare and contrast that with what actually went on with the project. And also just talk about my particular interaction with the peer review panel and where I found that concerning, and then I have some final recommendations that may differ a little bit from the Caltrans ones, but I think are in line with the basic goals. The High-Speed Rail Authority has used peer review continuously throughout its existence in all sorts of different contexts. It's had it for operations. It actually has, I just found out, a geotechnical and earthquake engineering peer review panel, which no one else knew about. I did get a report from them, and that should probably go on the website, and maybe they should talk to the Caltrans committee. I won't talk about that today. I will talk about the committee, the peer review panel that was created by the legislature to review the business plans, as well the ridership model that is still, I think, deeply troubling, had 3 separate peer review efforts on it. Peer review has a very long history in validating science, and I think we need to be extremely careful when we use the word peer review, because it does convey some kind of authority and some kind of acceptability for what's been done. And I think a lot of what we call peer review is not peer review. And it doesn't meet any of the criteria or the purpose or anything along those lines. Listening to the conversation about how Caltrans has used their peer review panel, to me it's a legitimate use, but I would just call it more like an ad hoc advisory committee or a they sound like you can call them up any day and say, come out with me on the bay. Right? That's an on-call consultant. And I think that's a very important thing to have, but it's not a peer review panel, and the advice would be taken differently. It's useful advice, but it's not something you'd use to validate or to verify. It is a cornerstone in the scientific method, and it's something that, it's mostly been used in science to decide what work is worthy of being considered, furthering science, what gets into the journals, what research gets funded. So there's been tremendous research into how you do research, and we know a lot of things about this. The independence of reviewers is paramount. That is the #1 top subject, and it's not something where you can simply have a disclosure. Disclosure is not enough. NIH has gone to some very strict standards now. If you have a conflict, you will not be allowed to participate except in very, very exceptional circumstances. The conflict of interest and bias, both negative and positive, taints reviews. And I want to make sure we understand and one reason why I would advocate for not just using the standard forms for peer review is the conflict of interest and bias are not just financial. It is personal relationship issues. This is something that's been proven through time. They've looked at the role of double, where they blind, usually for journals, it is blind as to you don't know who reviewed your work, but they've gone to now a double-blind system where you don't know whose work you're reviewing, because they found it had a substantial impact on what was being put forward. I take this a little personally, since women were the largely, who was discriminated against when they went to blind auditions for orchestras. A woman's chance of making it into the orchestra went up by 2 to 3-fold. The same thing with various different committees. It's incredible. So I think, and one of the things they've actually found, and economists have a real interest in this, is that the more somebody doesn't think they have a conflict or they think they're not biased, the more biased they're actually likely to be. So the more the lady doth protest too much. you really have to be very careful, and it's very real. I mean, this is why in the medical industry now they've gone to not just saying you should say whether you're getting gifts, no gifts. I mean, you're moving to hospitals, you're not taking a free lunch from somebody because it's impacting what people are doing. So to deny that this exists, we can say, and people have, I think, the best of intentions. I mean, I think they really, in their minds, think that they're not doing it, but it changes the tone, it changes the negativity, it changes whether you're willing to give somebody the benefit of the doubt, whether you just assume that something must be true, or whether you go and validate it. I mean, it has important consequences for outcome. Another thing is that reviewers are typically unpaid or paid just a minor honorarium. Once somebody starts to be paid substantial amounts of money, they are part of the project team. They are no longer independent. So in science, I mean, basically nobody is paid. And they still have this, they'll serve on review panels, and it's just considered what you do as being a member of the academy or a member of your profession is, yes, you'll spend a day preparing, you'll spend a day traveling, 2 days traveling, and then you might get your expenses paid if you're lucky. And these are for people who are used to being paid a lot of money per hour, and they will, if they're testifying in a court case or something, they would charge $600 or $700 an hour. So that is a standard in other places, and we need to think about that, because once you start paying people a substantial amount of money, they are no longer independent, and therefore you don't have peer review. You need to have protection for reviewers in the case of a negative review. And this goes back to why you have to think carefully about how you make a peer review process public. This goes back to the ability to say things in a candid way, is that you don't want any one person to take the heat for something. In the same way that you have sort of whistleblower protections, right? You have to really make sure that there are not serious consequences. And I saw this in the high-speed rail project when I went to try and find people in the academic world to participate and to look at the model and to do things, and they had one of two responses, which was, one, I would like future consulting gigs, and if I come out negative on this project, which I think I might, right, because I've looked at it, then I'll never be hired again. Or they said, I will probably come out negative, and then they will smear me in every professional meeting, and they will have a whispering campaign, and they will say that, I hate trains and I like, polluting the air, and, there'll be a smear campaign, and I don't want to do that. And we actually, I will say that these people were absolutely correct. I mean, this is what came to pass. And so thinking about how to protect reviewers, and as I said, so one way is, in the extreme case, you blind the review, you blind people from who's reviewing them. The second is you do think about in the deliberations phase, and I do think there should be active public participation in the review process, but there needs to be some way in which the reviewers can say things which they will not take, grief for, and they can be honest about. And the final thing is, I think that one of the things that was difficult in the high-speed rail project is that the results of the ridership study were written up in a very convoluted, complicated, thousands of pages, but yet not even having some of the standard information. Now, I went to graduate school, and people, the standards were higher for somebody writing a thesis on how many, angels dance on the head of a pin. So there need to be standard ways that the reports and the results are presented so that somebody can easily see if something is missing, because this is the challenge of review, is you only have what you've been given. You don't know what's missing. You don't know which tests were run that you didn't see the results of. And so in order to prevent that, in academics, you've generally gone to things where you have a very standard way of presenting results. So those are things that we understand it from peer review when, where we have sort of valid peer review. It should be understood, and I think this was mentioned earlier, that it has significant limitations, and we should appreciate those and understand those. It's not a cure-all. As somebody said once, reviewers are not there at the scene of the crime. I mean, they were not there when the original mistakes were made, and to actually figure out problems, right, takes this incredible ability to connect the dots, which is easy in retrospect, but very difficult on a prospective basis. And it needs to be understood. It is not going to find fraud. It is not going to find glaring errors. Typically, it's going to be, assuming that the people whose work that's been done were professionals to begin with. And so if you want to control the original work, you have to put both the onus on the person who produced it and the person who's reviewing it. It's only one part of quality control, and I think, that should be understood, that this is just one piece of that. Finding true peers can be difficult. This is both, and I think we've seen this is actually on on both extremes. One is, to find somebody with a specialized knowledge. I was in a review for a federal review of the ridership study, and there was an economist who had been brought in, but this person's specialty was nowhere close to what this model was, and they did not have the technical knowledge. But they'll be, oh, it's an economist, it must be fine. That's not the case. On the other hand, the NIH has considered now using patients and patient organizations in the review process, understanding now that what we've called lay people actually can have an incredibly detailed knowledge and have put more time and know more details than maybe somebody who's just coming in to review it. So I think it's on both spectrum, thinking about the width of the peers. It is limited protection against the momentum of a mega project. I mean, no matter how upright and upstanding you are, if you're being told that if you say this is not okay, that you'll cost 2 million jobs and, cause global warming, and, it's very hard to stand against that. So this process has to be, you have to think about this at the beginning and understand it's not realistic to think about something that could actually bring a halt to a project, that there is a responsibility to kicking one of these things off, because once it goes, it's probably going. Finally, I think real review, and this is not just peer review, real review needs as many eyeballs as possible, and this is what's understood now in software development, and this is why open source has become so popular. So many people are looking at something, as they say, like more eyeballs, you'll find basically all the problems. And so I think having as much transparency with the data, with the assumptions from the very start of something, this is a way to involve graduate students and things who can also have lots of time on their hands to dig deep into things. I mean, you do not want to limit this, even if you think that very few people would be interested. So on to the actual high-speed rail project. When we talk about the peer review group, the main one we discuss is one that was established by the legislature as part of the bond measure in 2008. There were a number of members appointed by various people in the government. There were 2 members who were to represent transit providers that were given statutory exemption from the incompatible offices prohibition, and I want to discuss that in a moment. And the one who's sort of been most active is Will Kempton on that. It had a role to opine on the funding plan, which was a critical step in the project, and anything else that the legislature wanted advice on. It was only established, however, after key aspects of the project were set in concrete. So again, it had limited ability to sort of stop things in motion. It was only advisory. It had no actual ability to be a stop or go. It did issue several influential reports, which I think were incredibly important, and testified to this committee on, I think, multiple occasions. One of the things that was most disturbing was after it issued a negative report at the end of last year following the business plan. And I've included just the press release from it, but there's a full 8 or 10 page, really a rant. I mean, I've never seen anything like this in public life. It was really a rant, and it was inflammatory, and it was unbelievable. So in peer review, the idea that you would attack the people who have been given a really important job and who have, they have gone out and they put their name on this. I mean, that cannot be acceptable, and there must be consequences for that. I mean, I was shocked. I mean, I was truly shocked, and I think that's something to consider. Because that really, if you want to talk about how do you encourage people to participate in these panels, if they think that they're going to have to give a positive opinion or be, subject to just, considerable personal attacks, and public, denunciations, you will not get people participating in this, and you will not get people participating in an honest manner. A couple of weeks after that, the High-Speed Rail Authority, they were going to issue another report on a separate thing that the High-Speed Rail had done. They actually delayed reporting that for several months upon the request of the High-Speed Rail Authority, who didn't want a negative report at that time. And so this is back to the independence, right? I understand why they did it, sort of, but it's not independent. So if we go back and we look at these things, I think on some levels it was independent. The participants were not paid. I think, eventually they got some of their expenses paid. Indeed, they actually didn't even have the basic setup to even, get copies made and stuff. So I do think it is important to have some kind of, offer some kind of administrative support to a group like this. But I think from that perspective, it was set up the correct way. I do think it was a problem that you had a member, that Will Kempton was both on this panel and was serving as a CEO of Okta. And this is back to the perception of bias. And so this allowed the rail authority to say that, he was conflicted and that he was just trying to get money for his agency, and I think that was a problem. And there was a reason why the legislature outlawed, has this prohibition on holding two conflicting offices, and I think it's actually a very wise one. And I think it's something that in future peer reviews, even though there is value to having the input from somebody, in these various roles, I think it should be, from an advisory standpoint, they should not be on the actual peer review committee. That's it sort of on the peer review group. I mean, I do want to just say in conclusion, I think they did contribute to the project. I think they had some, these ideas which were denounced later became critical aspects of the new revised business plan. So their advice was eventually taken. I think that they were, though, constrained by this lack of independence, ultimately. The next group is on the ridership study. There were 3 different reviews done. So Cambridge Systematics was hired in 2005 to come up with a new model to forecast ridership. And as part of their project, they actually ran 3 peer review meetings. So, and they hired and paid the participants on this, which is back to it's clearly not independent. And they were paid. And, this was, I think there were other people that were invited to come in and observe. So I wouldn't say it wasn't public. I mean, I think at that point nobody had any interest in this. But what they were asked to do was very limited. I mean, they were, okay, well, what do you think about this general approach? Yes, no. But later, the findings of these groups were used to say, well, this model is fine. It's been checked by peer review. And that was absolutely not the case because they did not find a number of things which have come out, later on here. After the bond measure passed, all of a sudden, interest grew, including my own, in response to what I think Senator Lowenthal called the sniff test, failing the sniff test, which was that lots of people would drive to Anaheim from San Diego to take the train. The legislature hired Berkeley ITS to conduct a review of the model and asked them to answer a basic question: is the model reliable for our decision making? And this is probably the closest we have of an independent peer review of anything that happened. They were chosen actually by this committee. They were approved by the High Speed Rail Authority. The institution was paid $36,000, but the individual participants, I don't believe, received any money for it. It was a limited, scope of review to is the model reliable. They had, I think it was a fairly healthy process where they went back and forth with the model developer. They said, we have this issue, what do you think? And they went back and forth several times. They did have to rely on the modeler's assertions. And at the end of it, they said, no, the model is not reliable. And then came one of the most extraordinary public meetings that I have ever seen, which was a high-speed rail board meeting held in Los Angeles. And this was more or less an orchestrated attack on the credibility of the University of California, who invented the field of transportation and ridership modeling. I mean, it was unbelievable. And I was personally just offended. These are the professors and the people who put the work into this. I mean, these are people who are there for the public benefit, and they were insulted, and their work was derided. And so this goes back to, you have to protect your reviewers. And this should have been unacceptable, but there were absolutely no consequences for the Rail Authority of having done this. And the Rail Authority went on, of course, to then ignore all the results from the Berkeley study, which was probably not a good idea. So finally, So just ignoring it didn't make the issue go away. It didn't fix the model. So eventually, in November of 2010, the CEO proposed that the original consultant on a $1.5 million ridership model should be given a budget of $4 million to fix the model, and that the CEO would convene his own ridership peer review panel. So these were hand-selected members who would be paid large amounts of money over a series of years to sort of work on the next generation of model, because this particular model was fine for current purposes. So this review fails basically every single criteria that you would have for a peer review panel. They were told that the authority had full confidence in the ridership consultant, and that their job was simply to help them improve it for the next time. That's not a review, right? That's an advisory group. In addition, they made a critical error in that the chair of the committee is an individual named Frank Koppelman. And it turns out that Frank Koppelman had significant conflicts of interest, none of which were publicly disclosed. And I've included in your packets a Los Angeles Times article detailing these, which are, just quite extraordinary. The head developer at Cambridge Systematics had been his graduate student, and Frank Koppelman had supervised his dissertation. They had written several papers together. They were personal friends who had dinner every month or two. As a matter of fact, the Cambridge Systematics consultant had recently hired Frank Koppelman on a couple projects and paid him thousands of dollars for work that he had done for him. In addition, they had just given a joint presentation. This is about as conflicted a relationship as you can get. Under NIH standards and any standards, somebody like this would never have been allowed to participate in a panel like this, much less chair it. Dr. Koppelman, said that this did not affect his judgment. I would just say from my personal interaction, I saw that it did. In my opinion, it affected the review. And the second page of my testimony, I have the amounts that they were actually paid. Over between March 31st of last year and June 30th of this year, Frank Koppelman, just for his work on the peer review panel, received $231,000, is being compensated a billing rate of $400 an hour. So, and his work is, 3 or 4 times as many hours as any of the other panelists. So this panel is critically relying on somebody whose objectivity, is subject to question. It is just incredible. So there's nothing independent about it, and I would not call it peer review. I do think they have done I think there are aspects of the work which I think are very good. I think they made some good suggestions which had the impact of lowering the ridership forecasts. At the end of the day, and I just saw the latest reports which mysteriously appeared on the website 2 days ago after not having been put up for a long time, that basically they've adopted most of the Berkeley recommendations and most of the recommendations that we've had for the next generation model, because, again, right, we don't really need the answer to whether this thing will make money for another 2 years after the concrete has been laid. I do want to talk a little bit more about, just how extraordinary this process was. So I'd worked on this model for years. There's been various levels of engagement on this. I actually put together a 16-page detailed memo of everything that I knew was wrong with the model and submitted this to the peer review panel. And this was after having asked on multiple occasions to have the opportunity to go to the peer review panel and present to them. Because I knew where at this point I knew where the bodies were buried, and nobody had taken me up on this. So I submitted to them a very, very lengthy, detailed report. Well, 3 months later, and this is really to the credit of one of the board members, Mike Rossi, put together a session on one topic, which we had issued an additional report about the price of gas in the model. Put together a meeting, which was a great meeting, which was myself, another colleague, Frank Koppelman, the consultants and Mr. Rossi. And we sat in a room, and I was able to ask questions and I said, well, this is my issue. I went through my report, and I said, well, this is what I'm saying here. And then they would say something, and I go, well, but that's not what I said. And we'd go back and forth. And it was unbelievable. It was an incredible experience, and I think we came to the conclusion that they were way off in what they were doing. But Frank Koppelman's participation in this model was actually concerning because, every time that he would figure out that I had proven that the consultants had made a mistake, he would try and come up with a justification for the behavior. Then later, so during this meeting, we had asked to record it because there was somebody with us who has hearing impaired, and they just wanted to be able to make sure they could go back and listen. It was a very technical discussion. Cambridge Systematics had been told by their lawyers that they would not participate if it was recorded. So, even though it was with me, a member of the public, it was still not in any way, shape, or form to be public. They submitted a memo, which, to me, a 5-page memo, which contradicted everything that had happened in the meeting. I went back and submitted another a 10-page memo back to them, and that was the last I heard from them. And I've only today, read the reports where they've said basically I was right and this is why they've changed everything. But it's a very strange process, and I've never been, it's a very one-sided meetings that are going on where the consultant is allowed to present their case. The peer review panel does ask them questions, but there's nobody else who's, I'm never invited, right? Nobody else who has any other thoughts on this model is ever invited to participate in this. And I can, going back to the structure of these meetings, everybody should be able to listen to what Cambridge Systematics says, because you cannot, you don't know what they're saying, if it's true or not true, and that's the opportunity to correct the record. If the peer review panel then wants to go off into a room and discuss things among themselves after they've had a chance to have that back and forth, then that's fine. But you have to allow the public, especially people who have been engaged in this, to participate. And I think there are lots of people around the world who know, a lot about a lot of these subjects and who could weigh on these different parts. So I think that this was a very troubled process. And I think just starting with the selection of Frank Koppelman, it was no longer a peer review. It was an advisory panel. And if he wants to have an advisory panel, that's fine, but don't call it a peer review panel. So just my recommendations are, there need to be clear guidelines, and you do need to distinguish between what we would call an advisory panel or consultants or whatever you want to call them, and peer review. If it's peer review, it has to meet these criteria. There needs to be a special disclosure form, and I've with both, because I think for several reasons. I think the Form 700 only deals with financial issues, and the kinds of bias and the kinds of conflicts that you have in peer review go well beyond that. It's if you've published a paper, the NIH, for instance, if you published a paper with somebody in the last couple of years, that's considered a conflict. If you have any kind of all those other kinds of relationships become very important. And the current 700 form does not do that. On the other hand, the 700 form, I think, asks for a lot of financial information, which is not necessarily relevant and may actually be off-putting to people who would participate in this. The final part of that form, though, should be what the NIH has instituted, and I have a copy of this. It's just a one-page certification where somebody has to certify that they don't have a conflict of interest. And this form is subject to perjury, so there are serious consequences if you have an undisclosed conflict of interest. This should never happen again in a situation like Frank Koppelman. Ever. And this is just unbelievable that you would have something like that going on. In addition, as I said, if they work for the project sponsor, if the project sponsor is paying them and they have chosen them, it is not peer review. Limit compensation. Respect the incompatible offices doctrine, and you need to find a way to protect those who participate, or you will not have people participating. You do need to have public participation. As I said, I don't think that means for a panel which has some kind of, where their work goes beyond just sort of advisory, I don't think that means the public has to be in the final deliberations, although there should be some kind of minutes or write-up of that. But I think in the beginning part where any kind of presentation is made to the panel, the public should be invited, and the public should be invited to contribute and to offer their input on this. As I said, if you had done this on we could have been years ahead of where we are on the ridership model if the initial criticism had been taken seriously. I did have a couple of other, just after listening to the testimony this morning, that are not directly peer review, but I think are related to this whole idea of mega projects and oversight of mega projects. I think the Bay Bridge-like reporting that's gone on since 2005 should be mandatory for projects that are designated as mega projects. There was a bill last year or the year before for the high-speed rail, which did not, pass, that would have similar kind of reporting, and I think it just simply should be mandatory. And I think, again, going back to the idea you have to have consequences for the original people preparing the reports. I mean, if it's Parsons Brinckerhoff who prepares a report on the construction cost estimates, they should have to sign it, and there should be consequences just like there are for public companies now with Sarbanes-Oxley. I mean, if you don't have anything on the line, the incentives in a mega project are such that there are just, if you can later think that you can justify it or you can this or you can that, right, the temptation to put lower cost estimates and higher ridership forecasts, I mean, it is something that we should expect and anticipate. And one way to do that is to have significant consequences for estimates that are not accurate. You shouldn't even, not only should the sponsor not select a peer review committee, they should probably not even be in charge of critical aspects like costing or ridership, which determine whether a project moves forward. I think you will have, it's just so fraught from the beginning that unless you separate that out and find a way to do those original, to do the work independently, that you'll never be able to get any kind of a review which will actually adequately find all the holes in it. As I said, you should, this is back to this idea to separate out advisory committees. One of the reasons we have so many conflicts I've just observed a tremendous revolving door between people in the private sector and in government. And people move back and forth on these projects. And unless we think about, and I think this is not an easy topic, but unless you start to limit that, you will always have people with conflicts. And you really, as we said, ideally you don't have people with conflicts on these peer review committees. You simply don't have it because disclosure has not been shown to work. I would look to formalizing a role for somebody, I think in the UC system, I mean, I actually think that's probably the people who you would look to have some kind of a role in ridership in this, that's sort of a standing role in which they are always the ones on deck, so they can't get hired or fired. And I think that's it. But it's really important. I mean, I think that unless we start to respect science and use science to help advance public policy, I mean, this has tremendous consequences as far as our ability to cost effectively, improve our infrastructure.
Well, you clearly haven't put much thought into this whole thing or time into it. And in relation to the smearing, I know how you feel. I've been called a declinist and a Lilliputian, or a Lillipulpin, I think, by somebody who has an office in this building, and I've had to go back to therapy for those insults. So, yeah, it's just one thing wrong with me, thanks, Ted. One of the things, as you were talking and just talking with the fine Republican staff to the committee, the idea of having somebody else, your comment about the sponsor should not be part of the peer review selection process. Have you found places where in public agencies where they do that? I think, so I was sitting here, I've been thinking about my time on the Air Resources Board, and they did lots of peer reviews at Cal EPA. They also have a scientific review panel that hires people from all over the country. And I don't remember, maybe since I've left, it's certainly involved in more controversial things, but I don't remember there being a problem there. But just off the top of my head, if we look at other sister agencies other than Caltrans, there's probably a lot of peer review throughout. There's peer review throughout,
which I'm saying, I think there should be standardized. I mean, and I just think that when we look at other areas where they have enough of, sometimes we just don't have a data set that you can analyze the impact on one agency or one this. But in other areas where you have a lot of review going on, I mean, the issue of independence has just been shown to truly impact the results and the outcomes. And so, one way this is back to where an agency might, put on a long list of people they consider to be, or they're just in general, right, across different states should probably share a database of people. Or, as I said, you have you have an institution like UC Berkeley or something like that, which is in charge of putting together these committees. I mean, I think it's really important, and I think we just don't understand, especially if people are being paid.
So your comments about consequences is always a struggle. In my experience, not the current group of people in this room, but there have been instances in my experience where public employees have, in my view, broken the law, but there are no consequences. So there's actually consequences for them not doing what they did.
So you need the equivalent of Sarbanes-Oxley. I mean, you have to have some kind of personal consequences if people, knowingly fudge the numbers. I mean, I think, and this just puts, makes people, there just haven't been consequences, and I think people have actually been rewarded, and it's shown to be a good strategy, to have lower costs. I mean, for instance, so Parsons Brinckerhoff did the cost estimating in 2009 for the high-speed rail project, which at the time we knew was low. I mean, we could look at it, and they were not costing the project that was on paper at that time, right? And they could come up with some but it was not the project that was on the paper. And then in 2012, when the cost jumps, they are paid to produce the paper that explains the difference. Mm-hmm. I mean, and then the results themselves were just extraordinary. So, one example would be, well, this went up because we moved, this section, the cost of this section went up because we moved something from another one into it. Mm-hmm. But then on the other section, they don't say, well, we should lower the baseline because we moved something out of this. I mean, it was just incredible.
Why do you suppose they did that? Never mind. Well, they continue to have a relationship, so...
They continue to have a relationship.
Very significant relationship.
That's correct.
Okay. Senator Gaines?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if, how do we go from here? I love your testimony, appreciate all the fact-finding that you've done in this process, but it seems like a model that we ought to try to incorporate. Mm-hmm. And if it's through a piece of legislation, we need to set these standards just as you're recommending, so that we don't have the financial interest conflict, and that we've got competent individuals that are truly independent. And I think the committee could take a look at this and see if we could move forward with something, because we do have these mega projects coming forward, and I'm just very concerned that things are going to run completely out of control financially, and we need to make sure that folks are being held accountable. I guess a question in terms of the ridership model, is there any corrective action that's occurring right now to address that issue so that we know what the true costs are?
The true costs or the true on the ridership?
On the ridership.
So what I learned this morning, because as I said, I think probably there was some kind of nudge because this meeting was going on. They posted a couple of the reports that had not been made public before. And, they are working on, Cambridge Systematics is still doing this. They're going to go back and get some new data, which is what we had said, that you needed new data. They're going to try and do these things, but there won't be anything available now for 2 years. And as I said, the process of redoing this model again is going on in private, right? It's going on behind closed doors, and they've chosen. In general, I agree with most of their general findings, but it's the tone and the does this matter or not, right? I think they sort of accepted there was only a certain time frame and this and that, I think that's problematic. I think that process needs to be open, and they need to have me, I need to be allowed to go to these meetings. And, and as I said, I don't need to be part of the deliberations, and they can kick me out, but they should hear, I'd like to be able to respond to these things and give my view.
Right. And do we have anybody from the administration that's at this hearing? Or?
Well, we have the first panel, but we don't have anybody from high-speed rail.
Yeah.
But I think, Senator Gaines, your suggestion is a good one, that we can, the committee with the consultants, your consultants, and the committees, the Democratic consultants. My idea is we sit down and work with the administration. We may not have agreement on all this. Certainly if we consider what Elizabeth has talked about, and we'd love to if you feel comfortable, pick your brain about how we resolve this, the whole issue of peer reviews and conflict of interest, because I'm taken by someone who knows this subject area very well, that describes some of this as nothing but crony capitalism, which I would tend to agree with. And then you have other issues about contractors who contribute fairly significantly to campaign contributions to office holders, which is a whole other issue. So, and then in other ways intimidate those of us who are elected to not ask these kind of questions. So it'd be wonderful to have a discussion. One of the things you said, Elizabeth, that I wish is the case is we're going to spend $10 billion for cement in the valley. I'm afraid we're going to spend $10 billion for right-of-way that never will get to be cement. And we're going to buy property from agricultural interests who are probably the most likely people to buy it back, and they'll buy it back at a discount probably. So we've got all kinds of issues, and I got it that the vote passed. Two of us didn't vote for it. I'd like to work with the administration of high-speed rail to see if we could fix it and make a good investment of it, not to be constantly haranguing them, because that's part of the whole dynamic. But I think both of these issues, if we're in agreement, that'd be great if we could work in a bipartisan way with the administration, with Elizabeth and other people who've put time into this, to see if we can come up with something that gets rid of the conflicts of interest in both entities. Certainly strikes me that your comments and the idea, going back to the Bay Bridge, that the peer review member who had a contract with Caltrans for $1 million and continue to be as part of the
and
peer
I think
review,
it should be understood
even
why
though
they're
we're separate.
Why they're not independent. I mean, I think the issue is that they're going to be constrained in what they can say, because even if it's not on the specific subject, right? So there's conflict comes from so many different ways, right? One is a conflict that you're conflicted because it's your design, so you don't want to say anything bad about it. But it's just simply that if it in some way limits his ability to be forthright, because he knows that this is somebody who he'd like to get future grants from. They're not independent. And I think it's reasonable that, UCSD, I mean, they should be getting grants from Caltrans. I mean, I think they're a worthy institution, and I would give them money to do research. But I think you need to understand then that they're not independent. They may be a very useful resource, and it doesn't mean you don't hire them to work with you on the project, but they're not an independent peer pan. I mean, they can't be.
I'm sorry I interrupted.
Does that make sense? I mean, that's the...
Yeah, no, I'm just listening. I agree with you, Senator DeSaulnier, that we ought to be moving forward in making sure we put the right matrix in place for true peer review. I want to work with the administration on that. I think, Governor has a reputation of trying to make sure our dollars are spent in the right way. And I think he's made some efforts even in parks with his recent appointments in the Parks Department where we had problems there. So I'm willing to move forward and work with you on a bipartisan basis to make sure that taxpayer money is not wasted and that we're not chasing our tail with a vision that could completely collapse in front of us if we're not careful in terms of the way it's administered.
Yeah. And this is something I've always thought that should be non-ideological when it comes to politics, that we should collectively all be trying to make sure that the public's money is as well spent as possible with as much independent analysis as possible. And that's the problem I think we have with peer review right now. And when I think of the economic crisis, since you're an economist, I remember some interviews during all that with the head of the department at Harvard who had conflicts of interest, who was saying that a lot of the models for securitization of mortgages was fine, but he was having the funding, as my memory serves me, was funded by the people who benefited from it. So there's a lot, I think, that we have to consider and try to make it better. Elizabeth, do you have anything to add?
No, I'm just delighted that you guys are holding hearings on this and that you guys are considering legislation. I think that's very important. I mean, that's just one of the things I found the most disconcerting about my involvement was just how science, I think, was being degraded. I mean, from a lot of reasons, that it was being used for politics and being politicized, and then you lose confidence in any of it, and you really can't. I mean, we can't as a society do that. So I think this is critical.
I really want to thank you and appreciate the fact that of your tenacity. It's hard for members of the public to stay at it as you have when you have a career and you have family obligations. You're not getting paid for it, and sometimes you think that's somewhat by design because it forces citizens to just give up and sort of shrug their shoulder and say, well, you can't fight with City Hall. So we're appreciative of all your efforts and look forward to working with you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Likewise, thank you. Appreciate it.